What in God's good name is Nintendo doing? Jesus Christ, how out of touch is Nintendo? Nintendo is just a constant stream of disappointment. Not getting a Wii U this year. This was freaking terrible. I feel like Nintendo just wants to alienate their fan base so that only hardcore fans remain. I feel like they should have cut their losses last year and created a trade-in program for Wii U owners, since supposedly they could recycle parts of the Wii U. Never have seen anyone bomb E3 like this ever. This E3 cements for me that Nintendo needs to stop building home consoles and focus on 3DS and software IPs. Yeah, that was the worst E3 event I have ever watched. When it ended, I was yelling seriously at my screen. So all of those quotes are real quotes from Reddit users. They are real reactions that people posted after Nintendo's E3 Direct in 2015. You see, in 2015, Nintendo was at one of their lowest points in the history of the company. The Wii U had failed them. The 3DS wasn't strong enough to carry the company alone, and already on his way out, consumers were losing trust in the company left and right. Their stock price was almost 80% down from its historic all-time high a couple of years earlier. And worst of all, more and more investors were arguing openly that Nintendo should stop producing consoles altogether and they should try to salvage what little was salvageable and become a third-party software publisher. About 10 years ago, Nintendo was in one of the most difficult situations in the history of the company, and no one was anticipating what was about to happen next. Fast forward a decade, and all of a sudden, Nintendo is probably in the best position they have ever been in. The Switch is on path to become their best-selling console ever. Their stock price rose by several 100% in just a decade. They released many of their best-reviewed games ever this console generation. And most importantly of all, they seem to have finally found a formula that does not only grant them success once, but that appears to be repeatable. Within 10 years, Nintendo went from one of their absolute lowest lows to probably the most comfortable position that they have ever been in. How did they do this? How did they turn things around so fast? And the answer is obvious. They did it with the Nintendo Switch. The Switch ended up being one of the biggest, if not even the biggest success in the entire history of Nintendo. But this raises another question, doesn't it? How did the Switch do it? What was the secret ingredient that made the Switch so incredibly successful? How exactly did the Switch cause this massive turnaround? So in this video, we're going to investigate this very question. We will travel back in time to crack this case. We will return to the year 2017, the Switch's launch year, and then we will retrace the entire life cycle of the Nintendo Switch year by year. We'll take a look at each year of the console, what games got released, what happened alongside those games, how the console was developing, and we'll stop and chatter about other interesting aspects of the Switch along the way. All with a bigger goal in mind, to find an answer to our question, to the question of why and how the Nintendo Switch became Nintendo's most successful console ever. So gentle ladies, gentlemen, and gentle people in general, are you ready? Then let's do this. Alrighty right, we begin our investigation of the Switch's worldwide success in 2017. 2017 was not only the year in which we all watched in awe at what we made Taylor do, it is also the year in which the Switch released. On the 3rd of March 2017, almost exactly 8 years ago, the Switch hit the shelves, and the Switch started with a bang. So first, obviously, Breath of the Wild, the first open-world Zelda adventure, released to tremendous critical acclaim. With an insane Metacritic score of 97, the game ended up not only being one of the best reviewed games on the system, it actually ended up being one of the best reviewed games of all time. Yet only a couple of months later, Super Mario Odyssey managed to pull off the same stunt for the Mario franchise. The very two best reviewing games of the entire console generation, already released in its very first year. something that's quite unusual. But even more unusual, even though the two games are the best reviewing games of the entire console generation, and even though both games were huge commercial successes, both only sold a fraction of the copies that the best-selling Switch game ended up selling that year. Even if we add the already impressive sales numbers of Mario Odyssey and Breath of the Wild together, the two games sold less copies than Nintendo's most successful game did, that was also released in 2017. Nintendo's most successful game of the entire console generation, and actually the best-selling standalone game that Nintendo ever released. The unbelievable success of this mysterious game already brings us to the very first, quite interesting aspect of the success story of the Nintendo Switch. So, there's something important, something that we haven't quite established yet something that we really have to waffle about if we honestly try to understand how the Switch became Nintendo's biggest success ever. You see, throughout this video so far, we've claimed that the Switch is by far Nintendo's most successful console. But is it though? If we were to strictly go by consoles sold, then the Nintendo DS is still slightly ahead of it. At the time I'm waffling this into a microphone, the Switch sold roughly 150 million consoles. The DS, however, sold 154 million consoles over its lifetime. And that's not all, because the fact that the DS sold 154 million copies is a lot more impressive than the Switch selling 150 million is. After all, the Switch is a handheld and a home console in one. The DS, however, was only a handheld. Yet if we add up the sales numbers of the Wii and those of the 3DS together, then Nintendo sold over 250 million consoles back then, a number that the Switch generation won't even get close to. But if the Switch generation sold less consoles in total than some of the previous generations did, then why am I jumping around claiming that the Switch is Nintendo's biggest success yet? Why do I think the Switch is the biggest success in Nintendo's history? Which brings us back to a mysterious best-selling game of the console generation. The mysterious game that ended up selling more than Mario Odyssey and Breath of the Wild combined. This mysterious game is, of course, Mario Kart 8! Mario Kart 8 Deluxe sold over 67 million copies on the Switch. Mario Kart 8 is actually the third best-selling standalone game of all time. Only Minecraft and GTA 5 sold more copies. Roughly 44% of people that bought a Switch also bought Mario Kart 8, an utterly insane attachment rate. Just to give you an idea how insane this number is, the best-selling game on the PlayStation 4 was Marvel's Spider-Man. That game, however, was only bought by roughly 17% of people that owned the PlayStation 4. The best-selling game of the DS generation was New Super Mario Bros. That game, however, also only reached an attachment rate of roughly 20%. Yet Mario Kart 8 reached an attachment rate of 44%. An attachment rate of 44% is pretty much unheard of. And it's not just Mario Kart that ended up selling insane numbers. There are 15 games that sold over 15 million copies on the Switch. On the PS4, for comparison, there were only 4 games that managed to pull such numbers. But even crazier, every single one of those 15 games was actually published by Nintendo. Actually, the 21 best-selling games on the Switch are all Nintendo games. And this is actually the reason why I think it is fair to call the Switch Nintendo's most successful console yet. It's not because of how many consoles the Switch sold, it's because of how many games they sold. No other console generation in history had such high attachment rates. First-party Nintendo games sold like crazy on the Switch. And in the end, this is how Nintendo makes most of its money. By selling games, not by selling consoles. The Switch might not end up being the best-selling console Nintendo ever made, but it certainly ends up being the console on which they sold the most games on, which is the much more important metric. Hooray! So let's return back to our little overview and let's find out what happened in 2018, the Switch's second year. 2018 was not only the year in which Prince Harry finally married Meghan Markle, it was also a very strong year in gaming. It was the year in which God of War and Monster Hunter World released. It was the year of Red Dead Redemption 2 and of Celeste. It was the year in which we got the return of the Obra Dinn and Dead Cells. Yet, On the Switch, it was a bit of a slower year after its explosive beginning. The best reviewed games on the console that year were the Switch port of Undertale and Super Smash Bros., both ending up scoring 93 on Metacritic. Smash going on to becoming the best-selling game on the Switch of that year. But, at least in my humble opinion, the most interesting thing that Nintendo actually released in 2018 wasn't a game. The most interesting thing that Nintendo released in 2018 was actually cardboard. It was, of course, Nintendo Labo. So for those that don't remember Nintendo's foldable cardboard tools, Labo was, well, it was foldable cardboard that could be built into little contraptions that were usable alongside the console. Nintendo Labo never really took off, and while I really liked the novelty of the entire concept, I can understand why. The whole thing was just a tiny bit too gimmicky and a bit too strange to really hit the mainstream. But the most interesting thing about Labo isn't necessarily Labo itself. It's something different. You see, Nintendo Labo was arguably the biggest new IP that Nintendo released during the entire life cycle of the console. We barely got any new Nintendo IPs this generation. The most notable new Nintendo IPs we got were ARMS, Astral Chain, Game Builder Garage, and Labo. Game Builder Garage and Labo never really took off, ARMS is already almost forgotten, and Astral Chains wasn't even developed by Nintendo, but by Platinum Games. So, in other words, Nintendo created almost no new IPs in the entire console generation, which is very unusual for Nintendo. But not only did they introduce almost no new IPs, their existing IPs also got very few spin-offs. All we got was Ring Fit Adventure as a new entry in the Nintendo Fit IP, Mario, who teamed up with some rabbits, Princess Peach Showtime, and Pokemon Legends. Other than that, Nintendo almost exclusively focused on already established series, which is quite unusual for Nintendo. In the past, Nintendo has actually been known for regularly trying new ideas and for experimenting with new IPs. During the very short and very failed Wii U era, for example, we got the first Super Mario Maker, we got Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, Hyrule Warriors, and of course the first Splatoon. It looks as if developing new IPs wasn't really a focus of Nintendo this console generation, and instead they mainly focused on all their existing, already established IPs. All their established IPs, but F-Zero. But I'm sure one day they'll clean up the office and find the F-Zero IP tucked away behind the desk. There's still hope, guys, which already brings us to 2019. 2019 was not only the year that Avengers Endgame ran in cinemas, it was also quite an interesting year for the Nintendo Switch. In 2019, the Switch finally released in China, the Switch Lite hit the shelves, and Super Mario Maker 2 released. The best reviewed game that year, however, was for the first time not a game made by Nintendo. The critically most acclaimed Switch game of the year was actually Dragon Quest XI, together with the port of Divinity Original Sin 2. Interestingly enough, however, the best-selling game that year was nowhere near the best reviewing one. The game that sold the most copies in 2019 was actually only the 73rd best critically acclaimed game that was released onto the Switch this year. It was, of course, Pokemon Sword and Shield. 2019 was a really wild year in the console's life cycle, but we haven't even talked about the wildest thing yet. You see, in 2019, Nintendo actually got sued for breach of warranty, for violations against several US state consumer laws, and for fraud. Oh and no, what fraudulent crime had Nintendo committed? What had happened? Well, a little drifting stick had happened, a little drifting stick that did not cause Nintendo a lot of joy. The Joy-Cons joystick drift, which might be a good moment to chat about the Switch's hardware. So, generally speaking, I think that the Switch's hardware has been keeping up surprisingly well. As a portable device, the Switch was already way behind the power curve when it launched, and 8 years later, the device is pretty much running on hardware that is ancient. Nonetheless, most first-party Nintendo games on the Switch still look pretty good to me. Nintendo really mastered giving their games a timeless, good-looking art style that is easily recognizable as being Nintendo, while also not being too technically demanding. Some games like Luigi's Mansion 3, for example, even look downright impressive, in my objective opinion. Overall, I think the Switch's hardware was a very solid choice for the job at hand. But there is one very obvious exception to this, and this exception is the reason why Nintendo ended up being sued in 2019. The Switch's joysticks are To put it mildly, catastrophically terrible. They were so terrifically awful that I'm still baffled that Nintendo even considered using this design. So the joysticks never felt good to begin with, but that's not even the real problem. The real problem is that almost all Joy-Cons eventually started to drift. Every single pair of Joy-Cons that I ever owned eventually developed this problem. The joysticks just started to very slightly push into a direction, even if they were perfectly still, which is like the most annoying thing ever. Most Joy-Cons eventually develop this issue, and yeah, I hate it. I hate it. If there's one aspect about the Switch that I think is an utter and complete failure, then it is this one. The Switch joysticks really ended up being simply awfully, catastrophically, really suboptimal. So Nintendo never got convicted in court for their terrible joysticks, but the fact that they got sued had an impact nonetheless. Several days after being sued, Nintendo finally issued an apology and started to repair the Joy-Cons free of charge and independent of warranty. And with this, it is already time for us to take a look at the next year in the console's life cycle, the year 2020.
The World Health Organization is holding an emergency meeting right now.
Well, again, what we know is that it's spreading. That's not really a surprise.
The first case of the deadly Chinese
A Washington State resident fell ill. Officials now say more than 400 people have been sick.
In 2020, the coronavirus pandemic hit and massively disrupted normal life all around the globe. Millions and millions of people suddenly found themselves stuck at home. Social contacts were minimized, events were cancelled, offices were closing. All around the globe, public life all of a sudden stopped. But amidst all of this drama, there is one small glimmer of joy for many people. A glimmer of joy that came in the form of a game that managed to give millions of people a bit of comfort during these difficult days. A game about indefinitely hanging out with anthropomorphic animals. The game being, of course, Animal Crossing New Horizon. By sheer coincidence, Nintendo happened to release Animal Crossing in March 2020, right around the time when most of the world was heading into lockdown. This coincidence ended up being a blessing in disguise for Nintendo. Animal Crossing went viral. The pandemic massively boosted the sales of Animal Crossing. The pandemic massively boosted Nintendo's console sales, and Animal Crossing New Horizon ended up not only being the best-selling game in the Animal Crossing series, but it ended up becoming the second best-selling game on the console, with over 47 million copies sold. Animal Crossing New Horizon is to this day one of the best-selling games of all time, outselling gaming juggernauts like Skyrim, the original Sims game, or the original release of Tetris on the Game Boy. Before 2020, the Switch was doing pretty good, but it was the pandemic that really put it on track to become such a tremendous success. And it was the pandemic that gave the Animal Crossing series an unbelievable boost, making it one of Nintendo's biggest franchises practically overnight. Interestingly enough, however, Animal Crossing was not the best reviewing game that released in 2020. This title is shared between two brilliant indie games that also released that year, Hades and Ori and the Will of the Wisp, which both ended up reviewing with a Metacritic score of 93, scoring 3 points higher than Animal Crossing. And with this, we already arrive in 2021, the year Netflix aired Squid Game for the very first time. 2021 was a bit of a slow year for Nintendo. The best-selling game of the year ended up being the remakes of Pokémon Diamond and Pearl that critics really did not like, followed closely by the re-release of Mario 3D World and Bowser's Fury. And this very port of Mario 3D World already hints at another really interesting aspect of the Switch, and the next puzzle piece that we need to puzzle together how the Switch became so successful. You see, a lot of the Switch success is actually built upon the Wii U's failure. So check this out. The 3 best-selling games on the Wii U were Mario Kart 8, Super Mario 3D World, and New Super Mario Bros. U. No other game sold more copies on the Wii U. Those are the most successful games that ever released on a console. And yet all of those games sold far more copies on the Switch. You see, the Wii U was a disaster for Nintendo for lots of reasons. But while the Wii U certainly had lots of problems, the actual games on the console certainly were not its major problem. Actually, Nintendo released many of their all-time classics during the Wii U days. They just released those wonderful games onto a dead console. Barely anyone was playing all the great games that Nintendo released in the Wii U era, simply because barely anyone owned the console. But this in turn meant that when the Switch released released, Nintendo was actually sitting on lots of great games. Great games that barely anyone owned. Super Mario 3D World, Mario Kart 8, Super Mario Bros. U, Donkey Kong Country, Tropical Freeze, Pikmin 3 and Captain Toad Treasure Tracker are all wonderful Nintendo classics that very few people had actually played. And thus, Nintendo did the obvious. They re-released all those games on the Switch, and people loved them. Every single game that Nintendo ported over to the Switch ended up outselling its original release. Every single one of them, often by insane margins. Just take New Super Mario Bros. U. That game sold less than 6 million copies on the Wii U. It sold over 18 million on the Switch. The fact that so few people own the Wii U ended up being a blessing in disguise for Nintendo during the Switch days. For most people that own the Switch, those games were brand new, which allowed Nintendo to sell tons of additional games and to smooth out their release schedule. All of this without having to actually develop a game. Hooray! Only 3 more years for us to take a look at. Next up, 2022. The year that Will Smith had an Oscar night that really slapped. 2022 was a really strong year for the Switch. Nintendo's best reviewed game that year was Xenoblade 3, but as it is so often, that game was nowhere near the best selling of 2022. Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, Splatoon 3, Kirby and the Forgotten Land, Pokémon Legends and Mario Strikers all released that year as well, and all of them ended up outselling Xenoblade. But by 2022, another really interesting aspect of the Switch starts to become apparent. You see, when Nintendo announced that the Switch would be a handheld and home console at once, most people were really excited. But there was one thing that I remember many people being worried about. What would this mean for the Nintendo franchises that so far regularly had gotten new games on the handhelds and on the home consoles? Would the fact that Nintendo was no longer producing games for 2 consoles at once mean that we would get less games in total? Would this be the end for 2D Zelda games or for 2D Mario games? Would it mean that some franchises would now get less games going forward? And the answer is... well, let's look at the data. Let's take a look at the history of Nintendo and let's analyze how many Zelda and Mario games we usually got during a console generation. During the Wii U and 3DS era, we got a total of 4.5 new Mario games, namely Super Mario 3D Land, 3D World, New Super Mario Bros. 2, New Super Mario Bros. U, and New Super Luigi U, which we count as half a game. If we were counting Breath of the Wild as a Switch era game, then the Zelda series only got a single new entry that generation, A Link Between Worlds on the 3DS. During the Wii and DS era, we got 4 new Mario games in total, New Super Mario Bros. 1 and New Super Mario Bros. Wii, and the 2 Galaxy games. The Zelda franchise got 4 games as well, if we count Twilight Princess as a Wii game. Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, Spirit Tracks and Phantom Hourglass. The GameCube and Game Boy Advance era gave us 2 new Zelda games, Wind Waker and Minish Cap, but only a single new Mario game, Super Mario Sunshine. Finally, there's the Nintendo 64 and Game Boy era, which gave us 3 Mario games in total, Mario 64, Super Mario Land and Mario Land 2, as well as 3 Zelda games, Majora's Mask, Ocarina of Time and Link's Awakening. So on average, we roughly get 3 Mario games per console generation and 2.5 new Zelda games. So how does this compare to the Switch era? Well, actually, surprisingly well. During the Switch era, we got 2.5 new Mario and 3 Zelda titles, Super Mario Wonder, Super Mario Odyssey and Bowser's Fury. Bowser's Fury being half a new game and half a remake. The Zelda series got Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom and Echoes of Wisdom. So at least Nintendo's 2 flagship franchises don't seem to have gotten less new games in total, and the same is roughly true for most other Nintendo franchises. The Pokémon games got about as many new games as every console generation. Yoshi got a new game, Kirby got 1, Metroid got 1. We got a new Luigi's Mansion game, we got a Paper Mario, a new Mario Maker, a Mario and Luigi game, an entry into the Pikmin series, and so on. All those series got roughly as many games during the Switch era as they historically did. The switch to the Switch doesn't seem to have led to fewer Nintendo games to be released in total, but instead gave us one single console with a massive library of Nintendo games. Which is good, and with this it's already time for us to take a look at the year 2023. 2023 was not only the year Barbie, Oppenheimer and the Mario movie were running in cinemas, it was also the year in which a metaphorical earthquake shook up everything at Nintendo. A dramatic event whose consequences we can't even fully foresee yet. So, if there is one thing that has been true for the entire history of Nintendo as a video game publisher, then it is that the Mario brand is at the front and center of everything they do. Mario is simply Nintendo's mascot. Their theme park is themed after him. Their best-selling games like Smash Bros. Or Mario Kart are themed after Mario. Their sports games are Mario branded, and so are their RPGs. Almost every Mario character has his own series, from Luigi's Mansion to Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, from Yoshi's Woolly World to Princess Peach Showtime. Even their Hollywood movie is about Mario. Mario is just at the heart of Nintendo. Which brings us to the shocking event that shocked the entire Nintendo fandom in 2023. You see, there is one thing that has been true for the Mario series since its inception. Every single mainline Mario game on every console that Nintendo ever released outsold its Zelda counterpart. Galaxy sold more than Twilight Princess. Galaxy 2 outsold Skyward Sword. Mario 64 outsold Ocarina of Time. Super Mario Bros. Outsold the original The Legend of Zelda. Mario Land outsold Link's Awakening, and so on. The Mario series just has always been more popular than the Zelda franchise. That's been true throughout the entire history of both series, without exception. Until the Switch era. Because during the Switch era, Zelda, all of a sudden, overtook Mario. Breath of the Wild sold over 32 million copies, while Mario Odyssey only sold 29 million. And that was not just a fluke, it seems to be a trend, because Tears of the Kingdom also easily beat the sales numbers of Mario Wonder, something that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Mario Wonder sold a bit over 15 million copies, which are strong sales numbers, but Tears of the Kingdom sold over 21 million copies, which is insanity. Tears of the Kingdom alone sold more than the original releases of Wind Waker, Skyward Sword, Majora's Mask, and Ocarina of Time did combined. The Zelda series overtook Mario as Nintendo's best-selling single-player series during the Switch era. And, we all know what that means, don't we? With the Zelda franchise now being more popular than the Mario one, the only logical thing for Nintendo to do is to retheme all Mario franchises into corresponding Zelda ones. Instead of Mario Kart, we might get Hyrule Kart, and so on. So here's a list of suggestions for Nintendo with ideas on how to rebrand their core franchises, now that Zelda overtook Mario. Super Smash Bros. Could be changed into Super Sheikah Smash, Mario Golf Super Rush into Ganon Golf Giga Green, Mario Strikers into Octorok Ball, WarioWare into Happy Mask Salesman merchandise, Mario Tennis obviously into Energy Ball Tennis, Captain Toad Treasure Tracker into Captain Tingle Treasure Chest Mapper, Princess Peach Showtime into Princess Skull Kid, Luigi's Mansion into Impasse Cemetery, and finally Yoshi's Crafted World into Lisfaldo's Knitted Country. Don't worry Nintendo, you can have those for free. You're welcome. Hooray! And with this, there's only a single year of the Switch's life cycle left for us to take a look at. 2024, the year in which Drake was not like us. The Switch last year as Nintendo's main console. We actually reached the end of the console's life. It is finally time for us to actually answer the question from the beginning of the video. Why? Why did the Switch end up becoming such a smashing success for Nintendo? Over the course of the video, we talked about a lot of different aspects of the Switch. A lot of different aspects that I believe are all part of the reason of why the Switch ended up becoming so successful. The global pandemic certainly boosted the Switch sales during a critical time in the console's lifecycle. The fact that Nintendo was sitting on tons of perfectly fun games that they had developed for the Wii U certainly helped them to smooth out their release schedule. The fact that the console was handheld and home console in one made it generally easier for Nintendo to sell the console, since it allowed them to combine two markets. And it meant that Nintendo no longer had to develop games for two completely separate markets at once. Nintendo made good hardware choices for the console, which allowed them to sell the Switch relatively cheap, but at the same time made the hardware powerful enough to never fall completely off a cliff during the console's lifecycle, like the 3DS did, for example, towards its end. All of those things, and probably many more, contributed to the Switch's huge success. But None of those things are able to answer the question of why the Switch became such a huge success in its entirety. Because actually, I believe that's not the correct question to ask. You see, at the beginning of the video, we waffled about the fact that the Switch didn't even sell that many copies in total if we combine the total sales numbers of home and handheld consoles. The real success of the Switch wasn't how many consoles Nintendo sold. The real success was how much software they sold. It's the insane attachment rates. It's the fact that more people bought Luigi's Mansion free on the Switch than people bought The Witcher free on the PS4. Or the fact that Kirby and the Forgotten Land sold more copies than Bloodborne did. The insane software sales are what made the console so incredibly successful. So the question of why the Switch was so successful might actually be the wrong question to ask, because the answer to this question is because people bought so much software. The much more interesting question, however, is why people bought so much more software on the Switch to begin with. Why did people buy so many Nintendo games? Why is the attachment rate so high? What is going on here? This is the real question that we need to answer if we want to understand why the Switch became such a success. And the answer to this question is, well, in all honesty, it's actually surprisingly simple. People bought so many Nintendo games on the Switch because Nintendo games have simply been really good for decades. Not every game that Nintendo ever released reached the same highs, but Nintendo almost never completely misses. Every Mario game has been either good or great for decades. So has every Zelda game, and every Mario Kart and Smash and Luigi's Mansion and Mario Party and Donkey Kong game. For decades, they almost exclusively released good to great games. But you know, if a franchise consistently releases good games, then this franchise will slowly but steadily grow a fan base that will buy every entry in it. And I believe this has just slowly been happening for decades. You know, I don't think that the fact that tens of millions of people bought Mario Kart is because of an insane marketing stunt, or because Mario Kart 8 just happened to magically tap into the global zeitgeist, or because it is such a revolutionary game that blew everyone away who played it. I believe the reason why tens of millions of people bought Mario Kart is because there simply are tens of millions of people out there that will buy every Mario Kart because they really like Mario Kart and trust Nintendo to deliver with each entry. And the same is true for almost all their core franchises. I honestly think the reason why Nintendo was able to sell so much software during the Switch era is simply because Nintendo has been producing great software in great franchises for decades, and those franchises simply grew a larger and larger fan base. You know, I'm often very critical of trends in Nintendo games and often point out when I think they're stumbling, but the truth is that those stumblings are usually exceptions. The general quality of Nintendo's games is incredibly high, and I believe this is the simple answer to the question of how they ended up in this comfortable position. You know, Nintendo is currently at a really interesting point in the history of the company. It's almost as if the company has finally grown up. There was so much chaos in Nintendo's history so far. From battling it out early with Sega, to losing all of a sudden to the PlayStation, from completely dominating the handheld space to the strange days of the Wii, going from the most successful consoles in the company's history to its worst selling and back again. And again, Nintendo tried new things over and over again. They stumbled, got back up and stumbled once again. Nintendo's history as a company is very unusual, but during all those chaotic times, there is one thing that was always true for the company. They always released good games. And during the Switch era, all this hard work finally began to really pay off. I very much believe that the Switch wasn't a fluke. Contrary to the Wii, the Switch success is built upon solid foundations. It is a success that is repeatable. The first time in the history of Nintendo. You know, the Switch 2 is right around the corner. And funnily enough, I don't think that the Switch 2 will be able to sell as many consoles as the original Switch did. The original Switch's hardware sales are just a bit inflated because of the pandemic, and it looks as if the Switch 2 will release into a much more difficult global economic environment than the original Switch did. So funnily enough, I don't think that the next Switch will be even bigger than the original one. But I don't think that this will be that big of a deal for Nintendo, because I don't think that the attachment rates for first-party Nintendo games will drop significantly. If anything, I think they will rise even further. As long as Nintendo continues to reliably produce good or even great games for all their core franchises, those franchises will continue to grow. And given Nintendo's track record, I'm not too worried about the quality of their games right now. Hooray! So here we have it, a look back at 8 years of the Nintendo Switch, why I believe that the Switch ended up being such a success for Nintendo, and my thoughts on Nintendo's situation moving into the next console era. Awesome. Before we wrap this up, as always, a gigantic Joy-Con drift defeating thank you to all my wonderful patrons whose names are currently scrolling by. It would currently not be possible for me to produce silly little videos like this one if it weren't for the support of these exceptionally exceptional people. A huge thank you for this. Finally, a thing that I wanted to waffle about in the video, but it didn't fit. So what does all of this mean for Mario Maker's future? The big question is if Nintendo considers Mario Maker now to be one of their core franchises or not. You know, is Mario Maker a series that they plan to release a new game for in each and every console generation going forward? Or is it something they did twice but don't necessarily care about in the future? And the answer is that I'm pretty positive that we will probably get a new Mario Maker on the Switch too, and probably even beyond. There are 3 things that make me believe that. So first, they ported Mario Maker over to the 3DS, and while the 3DS port of Mario Maker was terrible, to put it mildly, they still put Mario Maker onto every single console they have released since Mario Maker came out. Second, as we talked about before, Nintendo did not develop many new IPs over the Switch's lifetime, but instead primarily focused on producing entries into all their existing series, which is another good sign for Mario Maker. And finally, the Switch 2 seems to come with a built-in solution to Mario Maker's biggest problem: how to craft a great user interface without a Wii U tablet for a level editor, something Mario Maker 2 wasn't really able to solve. But the Switch 2 Joy-Cons seem to be able to be used like a mouse. At least the trailer hinted at this. Mouse-like controls for Mario Maker would finally solve all input problems. The biggest problem that Nintendo, in my opinion, faces with Mario Maker 3. So yeah, consider me hyped. Awesome, and with this it's time for us to wrap this up. So thank you so much for watching this little video. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a thumbs up, and maybe you feel especially Captain Tingle Treasure Chest Tracker today and want to hit the subscribe button as well. Finally, if you truly enjoyed the video and want to help content like this to survive on the platform, then there is also the option to support the channel via Patreon. Until next time, and lots of hugs.